Welcome to this event here at the Center for Global Development. Very, very excited to have you join us today. We are going to be talking about Africa beyond COVID. Obviously, the primary concern of governments across the continent now is ending the pandemic, is reacting and responding to the health effects of the pandemic, increasing health spending, getting tests, and taking care of patients that are sick, isolating the sick from the well, and that's the focus. But even as we respond to the pandemic, it is important that we begin to think about the continent, what the recovery will look like, what is the world in which Africa will emerge when this ends. We're very, very pleased today to welcome three distinguished panelists, and I'm sure most of you logged on today to listen to them, actually not me. And on behalf of the Center for Global Development, actually, we're very, very pleased. As an expansion of our Africa program here, we are increasing the number of fellows and non-resident fellows from Africa. And so today, our three non-resident fellows, Boholo Kedewendo is former Minister of Trade and Industry in Botswana. She's an economist. She runs a practice now, an advisory firm. She will be talking to us today from the capital of Botswana, Gaborone. We have Ken Opalo. Ken Opalo is a professor at Georgetown University. He's going to be talking to us from here in DC. And we have Nonso Obikili. And Nonso is a non-resident fellow, but he's in Lagos, and will be talking to us from Lagos. Lagos, right? Yeah. No, sorry, Abuja, my bad. He will be speaking to us today from Abuja. So once again, welcome everybody, and thank you for being here. We will begin today by acknowledging that there's been a rupture, there's been this change. 6 months ago, 7 months ago, the thing on people's lips, what we were talking about, especially so far as Africa was concerned, was the effect of the trade war between the United States and China and its impact on African economies that were really, really connected to the Chinese one. Now, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about COVID-19. So, Boholo, I just want to come to you about where Africa was when this happened. What were the priorities of the continent? What were the things that the continent was attempting to do before this happened? Where were the areas the continent was attempting to intervene before all of this happened, and where are we now?
Thank you very much, Jude, and a very good afternoon, morning to everyone joining us today. It's so interesting that now we're talking about COVID in 2020, when last year we thought this year we would be talking about a possible recession because of the trade tensions between the US and China. I remember last year it was such a heated discussion about how we safeguard the multilateral system and ensure that we fight all the protectionist policies as much as we could, but most importantly, to safeguard all these global supply chains that would be disrupted by the trade war between the US and China. Last year, we were looking at a potential disruption of African growth of about 2.5% reduction of growth. And this year, funny enough, or really ironically, we're looking at a potential reduction of 9% or so of GDP growth. And this is quite drastic compared to what we were expecting. But in those same conversations about how best we safeguard the multilateral system and we safeguard trading from Africa to the rest of the world, particularly to our two major trading partners, the US and China, we were looking at how best to implement, finalizing and implementing the African Free Trade Continental Area, and how that can help us really become bigger players in the global trading space and increase intra-African trade. But what was also really interesting about that plan for us was how we use the AfCFTA to play a bigger part in plugging the gaps that would be created by this trade tension, and how best we prepare ourselves to then supply to the US or supply to China what is being disrupted by those tensions. Unfortunately, what we saw or what we continue to see is that only economies like South Africa and Ethiopia were much prepared capacity to fill that plug. So we really just started engaging a lot further on how the AfCFTA can help us build economies and allow us to play a bigger part in the global supply and value chains.
Thank you. Thank you. We really appreciate that. But Ken, COVID-19 did happen. And even though we remain focused on tensions in international trade, the tensions were not introduced by a global pandemic. And even though every country in the world and every territory in the world has in some way been affected by this, are there unique ways that this affected Africa, ways where Africa was disproportionately affected that doesn't seem to have the same impact elsewhere? Well, what were some of the impacts on the continent? Because the reason this question is important is because if we're going to talk about Africa beyond COVID, it's important to be able to see the ways in which COVID has affected the economies of the continent and the continent as a unit.
There are definitely certain things that are unique to the African continent. And I would argue that, one of the biggest channels through which COVID has impacted the continent is the sheer lack of government involvement in people's everyday lives in ways that would help them cushion the pandemic. So, if you look at most African countries, even the more urbanized ones like Zambia, right, agriculture is still the mainstay as far as people's livelihoods go. And even in the urban areas, is this distinction between the formal and informal sectors, where the formal sectors may have some form of social protection, but the informal is typically very much ignored by the policy or any kinds of protections. And so that has meant that, the policy transmission mechanisms that would have allowed governments to better respond to the crises were not there to begin with. So that, if you wanted to stimulate the economy, using the central bank or, the finance system or generally typically would only reach the formal sector. But if you're in Kenya, the formal sector is a mere 20% of the economy, right? So in terms of employment. And so, I think African countries, I hope this is a wake-up call for African countries to think more broadly about, having fully integrated economies domestically, so that instead of having multiple economies, a formal sector, an informal sector in the urban areas, and then a massive rural sector that's only marginally involved in the formal economy, I think that model needs to be broken down so that, the entire economy becomes one. Which would allow governments to have, policy transmission systems that actually work, both in good and bad times. And then secondly, I think the other challenge that some African countries are facing is that during the growth that has actually been happening since the mid-90s, right, following the debt forgiveness of the mid to late 90s, many of them have racked up quite a bit of debt. Now, some of them invested those debt, the money borrowed from the debts wisely. Some did not, and so what you have is these massive infrastructure investments, some of which were not well thought out, and so they've not been able to generate the economic growth that they promised to generate. And so countries have lots of debt, but the investments are not paying back enough money to pay back those debts. Which means that the fiscal space to respond to this crisis will actually keep shrinking in the medium term, unless growth picks up maybe in 2023.
Thank you. So that's really, really true. So we have a continent that is largely informal, especially in terms of employment, and they're about lacking, targeting mechanisms if the government intended to intervene in the economy. And then obviously significant debt buildup for infrastructure, some of which was largely political and consequently not able to deliver economic benefits. But also, here we are talking about the impact of the trade war we're talking about implementing a Continental Free Trade Agreement, and this thing happens, and all of a sudden what it does is it exposes weaknesses in African economies, and maybe to some extent it also shows some strengths. When this pandemic ends, if these trends continue, when this pandemic ends, what does the continent look like? I mean, so where are we now, and what does it look like? What does Africa look like when we come out of the pandemic? There's been significant demand destruction for some of the products that most African countries export to the rest of the world, and we're going into a recession. Give us a picture of the Africa that engages the rest of the world when this thing ends.
Thank you, and again, happy to be here. I think on some level, Africa might not be too different after the pandemic. And I think as Mugula and Ken have kind of mentioned, on the one hand, agriculture is still a very, very important part of African economies, and that's probably still going to be the same after the pandemic. Those things don't change very quickly.
Okay.
On the other hand, Africa is still kind of exposed to the rest of the world through commodity prices. And again, that might not change very quickly. And in some sense, even though this pandemic is unique and new, for many African countries, the shock is very familiar because you have a shock for the pandemic. We also have a shock to commodity prices, which are not new kinds of shocks. And so there's certain familiarity about this particular event. Of course, it's complicated because of the pandemic itself, but the second order effects are kind of well known. But I think, and I kind of mentioned a little bit about this, there are some big risks that might surface after the pandemic. And I think the big one for many countries is the potential for debt problems. Many African countries have borrowed a lot in the past few decades, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not. And for many countries, much of this debt is external. And one of the things that happens when you experience kind of shocks is that you have deterioration in the macro space. You have exchange rate devaluations that make servicing external debts a lot more costly. I think there are many countries that are at risk of having significant debt problems that might last much longer than the pandemic. And so I think that's one potential problem that might spring up and that might change the trajectory of many African countries even after the pandemic is over. But there's also a potential for an upside. One of the important issues that has come up because of this pandemic is that you need a lot more resilience in terms of global supply chains. And I think there's going to be a lot more space for many countries to offer an option to what has been a China-dominated global supply chain. Not all African countries are ready for that, but there are a few that you can see that might be able to take advantage of these new opportunities. I think that's something that might be different after the pandemic. You might see a lot more countries kind of get involved in international trade in ways that they were not before. Not because they're necessarily a lot more competitive, but because the world is looking to diversify a supply chain to build more resilience. So I think those two things are kind of key issues that might change for Africa after the pandemic. But again, in global terms, this pandemic is kind of a one-in-a-century event. It's unique. Nobody quite knows for sure exactly how it will end up. So I'm wary of of predicting anything, but I think there are signs that some things might change.
Thank you, and you're right. This is so unusual that it's difficult to be able to predict exactly what. But what I wanted to, before we switch over to talking about maybe recommendations and what Africa after the pandemic looks like, is in spite of the difficulties and Manonso mentioned this a bit, in spite of the challenges that is and the weaknesses within African health systems and economies, weaknesses that have been exposed by this, are there any silver lining? Did we get, so I would just go first and say that, one of the things that we've seen is that the pandemic has been an accelerant of the digitization of African economies. A lot of platform-based e-commerce websites have seen an uptick in the utilization. And for places where there isn't significant infrastructure, it might end up being really being a positive, and this trend looks to continue. So I will, whoever wants to start first can start, to see if there are any silver linings and if there is an opportunity here for Africa.
If I can inject some optimism into the discussion, yeah, I mean, so my first thought when this hit was, and the enormity of the crisis was becoming apparent every day, was to ask myself, are we back in the early 80s? The crisis of the 80s produced a long decade of 15 years of basically massive contraction with attendant consequences for African countries. I don't think we're in the 80s. I think African countries will survive this crisis better than they did the commodity price collapse and the debt problems of the 80s. And part of that is because the policy space is a lot more sophisticated now. If you look at average inflation in African countries, price stability has been quite okay in most countries, Zimbabwe is notwithstanding. The intra-regional trade within the regional economic communities is actually bigger than we think, because we talk about intra-Africa trade. Kenya may not trade so much with Nigeria, but Kenya trades a lot with Uganda and Tanzania.
Right.
And so, I think those connections will provide sub-regional level supply chain systems that will be becoming stronger and more resilient. And then to mention, to further reinforce Nonso's point, I think the African countries that will be ready to take on this inevitable rejigging of the global supply chain system, with lots of countries in Europe and North America seeking to diversify away from China. I think countries that will jump on that opportunity will do very well for themselves in the long run. So I think there are definitely opportunities. Some of those will be built on top of the successes over the last 30 or so years. But then, some of the opportunities will also require smarter thinking in terms of policy development and strategic planning on the part of African countries.
Sure. Paholo, you were going to say?
Yes, I was going to say, while I believe that we're going to see a lot more players in the continent being a part of the global supply and value chain, there is also, or we should expect a shock to FDI, because everyone at this particular moment, and we saw this in the early months of COVID, that everyone was starting to be more protectionist, looking more inward, and they are putting up policies that will ensure that investments stay in their countries, particularly in the West, that has been as hard hit as the rest of the world. So we should prepare ourselves as the continent for drying up of investments and start to really stimulate more domestic investments and ensure that we are growing some of these domestic products and opening up regional supply chains, regional value chains, and really work on implementing the AfCFTA. I saw that we've been talking about delaying the implementation of the AfCFTA, but I think this crisis offers a very good opportunity for us to stress test a lot of these transformative policies and strategies in the continent. So you've talked about digitalization, which I believe it's fantastic right now. Last year, when we were talking about this, no one wanted to listen to us. I remember during the high-level panel on digital cooperation, we'd talk about this with African countries, and digitalization would be seen as a Western thing. But right now, everyone is seeing the importance of investing in ICT infrastructure, and I'm hoping that even in the multilateral financing spaces, we will start to see that financing moving from the current 4% of their budgets to maybe around 10%, and even for policy around ICT infrastructure, moving from that 1%. And I think another silver lining that we're seeing here is an accelerated investment in our healthcare. And this is one area that many countries have struggled with. And now we're being put in a corner to make sure that our healthcare systems are compliant. But it has even rippled further beyond just healthcare. In Botswana, we're seeing it even in the education systems. Classes are being revamped, they're being refurbished. And these are things that have been needed over the past couple of years. And we're being put in a corner do them. And I believe another one is that we will see governments be more efficient in service delivery as they introduce more digital-based online and both offline. I want to state this, online and both offline solutions that deliver services a lot more faster. And last year, when we were talking about the US trade war, we were also quite excited that, yes, China is offering this China-Africa Development Fund for the development of the continent, but it challenged the US to also introduce Prosper and Power Africa. And those are still in play now, and it is the right moment for us to cash in and really accelerate the developments in the continent.
Thank you. Thank you. Nonso.
Yes, I think Ken and Bogole have touched most of the points, but I have 3 extra things I want to kind of add that are silver linings. I think the first thing is that the crisis has demonstrated the importance of cooperation. I think this is going to be a plus for the AfCFTA, maybe not immediately, but in the medium term. It has demonstrated that cooperation with neighbors, with countries is very, very important for tackling some of these mutual issues. I think that's going to be a plus going down the line. Second thing is, I think the crisis has represented an opportunity for many countries to kind of implement some reforms. And we've seen some big reforms in some big countries. In Nigeria, we've seen energy subsidies scrapped, hopefully, finally. In South Africa, we've seen attempts to tackle state-owned entities like SAA. And these are reforms that may not have happened if there was no crisis, but that would have impacts long after the crisis has gone. So I think that's a potential silver lining. And the third is, there's one thing that's different in Africa this time around. Everybody now has a phone. Not everybody, but a large chunk of the population has phones. And many countries are experimenting with using phones as a means of delivering social welfare. And that's something that has been accelerated because of the crisis. Many countries are looking at using mobile phone data to figure out who is poor, or using digital financial services to directly give cash to the most vulnerable. And these things have been accelerated again because of the pandemic. So that's a silver lining as well. And I think that's those are 3 things that I think are kind of pluses. In a sea of negativity, I think those are some pluses that we can look up to. I think you're muted also.
I was muted there. With the rest of the time that we have here, one of the things that we wanted to do was to give you, because you're experts in your field, to give you an opportunity to propose policy recommendations as we come out of this in terms of where the continent should go. And before we get to that, I think it's great that we've seen that cash transfers have been the chosen model of state intervention to be able to give social benefits and grants to people. I mean, in places like Togo, they're doing really innovative things like looking at the balances on the airtime and the amount of airtime a person gets to be able to see who's poor and be able to transfer it to them. But there's still underlying questions about infrastructure, right? Even if we digitize everything, you still need roads over which to be carried. You still need warehouses in which it will be built, right? And so there's the questions of continuing to do infrastructure, but to do it in a smart way, right? So that the infrastructure doesn't simply become a white elephant. So as we go forward, I want you to think of these 2 questions as you propose your policy recommendations. The first one is, this is from, one of the questions that came through was, what does building back better mean in your perspective? If we're rebuilding and building back better, what does that mean? And then the second question is, what needs to be in place in terms of policy and infrastructure to take advantage of? It's something I was just talking about the digital transformation, or the ability to be able to, because like Ken said, like Nonso said, there is going to be, the world is not going to return to its pre-COVID rhythm. There's going to be a rupture and a restructuring of global value chains. And what needs to be in place for Africa to be able to take advantage of this. So for the rest of the time, we will, whoever wants to go first in terms of your policy recommendation, whether it's to Nigeria or it's to the AU or whether it's to Kenya or it's to South Africa or to SADC, we would like to hear your recommendations and to take those two questions into account. Whoever wants to go first.
I think I can go first this time.
Go ahead.
Okay, sure.
I think the digital revolution is already here. I think one of the things that has been clear since the pandemic hit is that many things can be done remotely. And I think that presents a tremendous opportunity for people in developing countries who can work for cheaper in many instances, start to participate more in the global economy. But I think like Bogolo said and Ken said, and you said, that can happen in a vacuum. You need infrastructure for that to happen. You need internet services, you still need legal systems, you still need roads, you still need all these background institutions, but I think the opportunity is there for all that to be taken advantage of by Africans. And that's, I think, one thing that I think our countries need to focus on. Second thing I think that needs to be kind of reiterated is that economics does not change after the pandemic, right? The policy environments before the pandemic is probably still going to be true. So there's no need to try to reinvent the wheel too much. I mean, there's room for innovation. There's always room for that. But in terms of the basics of economics, the story is still the same. Price fixing is still mostly not a good idea. Exchange rate crisis can still be problematic. Diversification of exports is still going to be a challenge. So I think, even though we're trying to look for opportunities now to build back better, as we say, it's important not to abandon, the basics of economic policy. You still need basic economic policy to be functional for any economies to work. I think it'll be important for African countries to kind of remember that. While you're trying to build back, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Don't try to implement brand new economic ideas that have been proven in the past to not be very sustainable.
Ken?
Yeah, so before I talk a bit about building back better, I'd like to go back to the question of cash transfers and social protection. Mm-hmm. I think this crisis is a reminder that African countries need to invest more in sort of systemic forms of social protection. While I very much like cash transfers as a means to cushion households against shocks, it's also important to think of a programmatic form of social protection that will be dependent on a regular stream of revenue that's politically sort of protected for the long run, because one of my fears is that African countries, as the economies are growing, are building social protection systems that are very ad hoc and therefore politically vulnerable or fiscally vulnerable, right? So many countries are still financed by donors and not taxes. And they're not, part of public debates about, the redistributive politics that are needed to anchor them into the individual countries' political economies. So I think this crisis presents African countries with a way to, think through social protection policies. Southern Africa has done this. Southern Africa typically has more robust social protection systems than countries in further north and west. Now, on building back better, I think the one big recommendation I'd give African countries is to rethink the model of investing for growth, right? For a long time, the model has been that, most investments on the continent appear to be targeted at attracting FDI, right? So, if you pin African policymakers to the wall, they'll tell you that the only reason they're implementing all these reforms is so that they can, get the World Bank to say nice things about them, so that the foreign investors can come in, right? And I think as Bogolo pointed out, right, we need to rethink that, because what if FDI is not forthcoming? Right? There's a massive untapped investment opportunity in African countries, and so perhaps this crisis will force policymakers to think through, if we are building roads, how can we build the roads to make sure that value add in agriculture goes up, so that if foreign investors are coming in to use the roads, so railway lines, well and good, but at a minimum, you're guaranteed a domestic sort of bump from these investments. I think that would be the number one recommendation. The number two recommendation would be echoing Nonso's points of, don't ignore the basics, right? It's been absurd seeing African policymakers ask their citizens to wash their hands regularly when, reliable running water in Nairobi, Kampala, Dar es Salaam, Lagos is a problem, right? You can't ignore the basics. So, water systems, roads, planning so that cities are planned and zoned well, helping agriculture because that's the mainstay of most economies. So, in addition to thinking high level about what the development model should look like, also making sure that you're building the basics to be in order to be able to be more resilient for the next time, because there will definitely be a next time. There should be a learning opportunity for the next time.
Thank you, Ken. Baholo?
Thank you very much. I think the first thing we should think about on policy recommendations and the kind of Africa that we want to see. So your earlier question was, what will Africa look like post-COVID? There's what it would look like and what we would like for it to look like. And for me, what I would like to see is that we are not wasting this crisis. That, like I said earlier, we are stress testing a lot of the transformative policies and strategies that we've been talking about. It be at regional level. I know in SACU and in the EAC, we've been talking about how best to develop regional value chains. And we were trying to select industries for us to focus on. And this was actually nothing new last year when we were talking about it. For us, it was something that, we've been talking about for years, similarly with the AfCFTA. And I think this is showing us that we can't always rely on global trade, but we should really start to work on regional and on continental, because we recognize that RECs are the base blocks or building blocks of the African continental free trade area, as well as for a well-functioning multilateral system, so supporting the WTO, which I'm hoping that Madam Ngozi will later assume that post for. But what is important, and I think just aligning with what both Ken and Nonso said, is we need to build resilient communities. And in building resilient communities, we're providing the basics. We're providing the basics, and we should spend now. Now, this is my first policy recommendation. Spend now, provide the fiscal stimulus now, so that we avoid a bigger and deeper economic scarring later. Because if we do not provide those cash transfers, and for example, here we're focusing on food packages, I think we are just going to draw more people into poverty, particularly those that have been vulnerable to poverty or susceptible to poverty. So we really need to have more deliberate interventions towards that particular group, because if we don't do it now, then they are going to be a heavier burden on our fiscus a little later on in the coming years. And while some are looking at these past 3 months as having been the COVID months, I think we still have bigger shocks to come in our economies in the next 6 to 9 months or so before the economies fully recover. And in that time, we need to really reform, look at our doing business environment policies, look at how we stimulate investments, change our incentives, and start implementing them now so that we stimulate any kind of domestic investment that is lying low within our countries. But particularly work on our monetary policies that will ensure that whoever has been working on offshore banking, all this African capital that has been lying outside of the continent can be brought back to help develop infrastructure and invest within the continent. And I think, so the second one would be looking at private sector development, because for the continent, we should move away from looking at being heavily dependent on government expenditure as source of growth. We should really invest more on that particular area. We should look at our exchange rates, monetary policies, fiscal policies as a way of incentivizing private sector growth. Now, the last one is something that I think we've all agreed is digitalization within the continent. And I am very pro this because I think it will ease a lot of our issues if we invest just a little bit in ICT infrastructure. Again, I want to highlight that ICT infrastructure is not all about being online. There are lots of services that are being provided through mobile phones. I was helping one other country where they were looking at ID system, providing an ID infrastructure, and they ended up using mobile numbers as an ID system. And what we need to start investing in those areas in order to deliver on e-health, on edutech, and so forth, things that we know will will leapfrog us to the next level. Again, I recommend that people read the report drafted by us last year by the level panel on digital cooperation, because the number one item that we talk about is inclusion into a digital economy, more inclusion in a digital economy, and how to close that digital divide. And I think that is a very important recommendation that a lot of African economies should look at, but also our development partners as well as multilateral institutions should look at in order to just restructure the way that they look at financing within the continent.
Thank you, thank you. I think all of those are really, really excellent points. And as we think of rebuilding and as we think of building better, like Nonso said, simply because there's been a pandemic doesn't mean that economic principles change. It's about doing the basics, doing the things that we've been asking for, things that if we had done those things 10 years ago, we'll probably be more resilient in terms of our response to the things that are happening now. We're about to close now, so I would ask each of you for final words, no more than 1 minute. But before I do that, I think going forward for a continent that we want to see, one is the role of mobile phones and mobile payments. I mean, beyond cash transfers, they've become really, really important. And having the underlying infrastructure, especially for interoperability, is going to be really important. Part of the reason is because a significant number, in some instances, up to 80% of the labor force is in the informal sector. And so for them, mobile transactions become even more important. I mean, we're seeing now that in places like Kenya, the mobile transactions exceed what's happening in the traditional banking sector. And so governments building the infrastructure to allow that to happen will be able to capture more of what's happening in the informal sector. The second thing is definitely agriculture. Up to 58% of the labor force remain in agriculture, but most of that agriculture remains unproductive, right? Very little use of inputs in that agriculture. And so instead of simply, like Ken said, government spending for growth and focusing our attention on this elusive ghost of FDI, and that we can begin to actually pay attention inward. And I think the AfCFTA provides us an opportunity, if Nigeria opens the border, for us to do cross-border trade and be able to develop the economy. But it's been excellent having you guys. So I would like to go around the room and have each of you for a minute give us your parting words, whether it's a recommendation or something you forgot to say or something you want to add. I will now open it up to you. Who wants to go first? All right, Kent, you go first.
Okay. I think the on mobile transactions, I think it's a great idea that many African countries have been able to use mobile platforms to expand financial access. I think the next level game will be to go beyond these $30, $50 overnight loans to proper financing, especially with a focus on SMEs and medium-sized farms. You know, if I had all the money in the world, one thing I would do is just, you know, have an index of SME success in African countries, because I think that's the best metric of how an economy is doing. Economies that you know, have resilient SMEs that will keep growing from, you know, 2 to 50 to 100.
Ken, just sorry, 1 minute. I misread the time. It's not. We have time. Sorry.
Yes.
So please, don't ignore my 1 minute thing.
Great to hear that. I was going to ignore it anyway. Yeah. So you know, having resilient SMEs will allow for the massive job growth that we need to be able to employ, you know, the many unemployed youth in African countries. And to do that, you know, it will be, it will also require investing in agriculture, as you pointed out, you know, boosting agricultural productivity, which will inevitably leave lots of people, you know, not needing to be in agriculture, and so those people would have to be absorbed into some manufacturing sector, whether in the rural or urban areas. And then, you know, one last thing I would say is that I've always been surprised by the fact that, you know, so if you go back to the 70s, many African countries actually had deliberate urbanization policies, right? Then, you know, the idea of urban bias somehow got accepted as truth, which forced lots of African countries to basically de-invest in urbanization, right? While, you know, yes, there are countries like Zambia that went too far in subsidizing urban areas, but, you know, I would argue that there's still a need to have deliberate urbanization policies, because the whole mix of improving manufacturing while also boosting agricultural productivity, so you transfer the labor force from ag to manufacturing, will not happen magically. It will require a lot of policy intervention. And I think to the extent that African countries continue to ignore this question of how do you urbanize properly, how do you urbanize while also creating jobs? And to finish on this, you know, there's a good paper looking at comparing urbanization in Africa versus, say, Southeast Asia. What you've seen in Africa is that urbanization in Africa has not been accompanied by increases in labor productivity in the urban areas or manufacturing, right? Because most of the time, you know, it's people just migrating to the urban areas in search of formal employment or, you know, vending in the streets. And, you know, in places like Dar es Salaam, you're basically seeing a ruralization of urban areas where people are actually beginning to grow their own food in the urban areas. So, you know, this is a big policy challenge that African countries have to tackle head on as they're urbanizing, to also think through, you know, how do you do this while improving labor productivity, and most crucially, making sure that manufacturing and these small and medium enterprises flourish to absorb the excess labor force.
Before Nonso comes in, Nonso, in Nigeria, well, again, a significant amount of the labor force is also in agriculture, but the scale of pre-harvest post-harvest loss is so massive. I mean, if there were a way to even preserve a significant portion of the harvest, it would affect food security tremendously. And so there is an opportunity there for, even at the most basic level, light manufacturing and processing what is grown locally. That could be actually the beginning of having to make African agriculture productive. Because like Ken said, our goal is to be able to transfer unproductive labor away from subsistence activity into more productive sector. And that is, you know, in some form of manufacturing, and processing what we grow locally actually becomes an opportunity to be able to do that. Well, what do you think of this?
I think one of the unfortunate statistics in Nigeria is that agriculture is still a major employer of labor, but most people employed in agriculture are poor. And if you look at yields for many crops like rice, they are still some of the worst in the world, which kind of signifies, as a friend of mine says, in many countries in Africa, you don't choose agriculture, agriculture chooses you. You're born into it, and that just remains what you do. I think that needs to change. We need to start to see agriculture as a business, as opposed to just an activity that you do to survive. How that happens, I don't know. I think there needs to be lots of room for flexibility. We know some things are important. We know if you have better dams and irrigation infrastructure, that is good. We know if you have better yields, better roads, feeder roads to evacuate crops, that's good. We know if you have markets that can get agricultural products into the hands of processors, that's good. But I think we should be wary about trying to pick and choose winning crops like we've done in the past, where we decide, well, maize is a national crop and we'll do that, and then that ends in tears. So I think we should be wary of that. But I think in general, not just in agriculture, but across most of the economy, productivity still needs to be the focus. And in the long term, that's about investment in education, infrastructure. I think we can focus on those two things, then we can start to see real progress. But I don't want to say something on the mobile money issue. I think it's great that mobile money is becoming very dominant in many African economies, and the growth has been tremendous in many places. But I think there is a potential stumbling block that we need to think about. In many countries where you see mobile money become important, you see network effects result in transactions being dominated by just one company, which has made many governments very uncomfortable. Not just in Kenya, but even in Zimbabwe recently, even in Nigeria. And that has the potential to kind of limit the progress that mobile money can make. So I think there still needs to be lots of thinking, lots of innovation in exactly how to make mobile money much more competitive and to avoid these potential roadblocks. So I think that's something that people still need to think about. We shouldn't just assume that it's a success because it's not yet, and there's still lots of room for improvement. I think the final thing I want to say is that if you look at the raw data today, Africa still accounts for just about 6% of global GDP and even less of global capital. And so even though we want to focus more on domestic investors and domestic productivity, we can't ignore the international economy. As we say, if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. And so African countries need to really think about how to muscle their way into the global economy, muscle their way into global supply chains, muscle their way into the discussion. And I think the AfCFTA is a big part of that. And that's something that we need to seriously make sure does not fall by the wayside. And I think those are my final comments.
All right, there's one area that I want to comment on Nonso's there in regards to muscling our way into the global supply and value chains. And by using the AfCFTA, I think it's very important that African countries not engage in bilateral agreements at this particular point and wait for the conclusion of the AfCFTA so that when we negotiate, we have a stronger and bolder voice together, because of course the US is trying to find one that with, and we have careful with that and ensure that we don't find ourselves in a compromising position or a weaker negotiating point. I'm so sorry, I have like a nest of birds around my house, so they have decided it's time for them to come home. So it's quite loud here. So I think leveraging on our collective negotiation strength will be very important going forward. And when we also look at, again, in play in the global space, we have to economic policies, but we need to ensure that we are not just saying we are targeting FDI. What we're targeting is investment, period. If it comes domestically, if we're stimulating Africans to take the money from wherever it is that they had put it outside the continent, or any other companies from outside the continent to come into the continent, fantastic. And I'm hoping that our investment strategies will be as responsive and agile during this period, because everything is like a moving puzzle, you know, and we need to be as responsive as we possibly can to ensure that we do not miss this time. Again, I'm a strong believer that we do not waste crises. In relation to to FDI and the kind of saying they will not implement protectionist policies, because we all know that beggar thy neighbor policies will only deepen economic crises, not only for the country, but for the world. And we need to continue pushing for more open trade policies, for strengthening the multilateral space, and particularly for African countries, look at policies and be very deliberate and bold at SME development and the protection of the informal sector. Once again, I fear that if we do not do that in this particular time, then 3 years from now, we will be talking a whole different scenario of increased poverty and inequalities in the continent. And that will be very regressive to what we've been working for in the last 10 years. And particularly the mission and the vision of the AU about a better continent, even for 2063, we need to implement those now. We should work for an economy that we want, that we aspire for, policies for a futuristic economy, and not just for what we currently have.
Yeah, with due apologies to everyone for Kenya pursuing a bilateral trade deal with the US.
We have some questions coming, and so I would like to go to the questions that came in from the audience. But before I go to the questions that came in from the audience, there is this issue about the role of Africa's development partners. The U.S. I think it's the Secretary of State who continues to make this statement that the U.S. sees itself as the partner of choice of Africa. And the argument that we've made is that Africa doesn't want a partner of choice. Africa wants partners, that the scale and gap of Africa's needs are too large for any one partner to be able to provide it. So what role does Africa's partners have here? Whether it's the EU, whether it's China or the US. So think of that. And then I'll just go to the questions. One was, how do we build more infrastructure without debt or damaging PPPs, right? And so, and what would be the priorities of the AfCFTA to attract investment? The third question is about privacy concerns and the safety and protection and privacy of data that is being collected from people as the economy digitizes. What are your thoughts on these issues? So one, the role of partners. Two, how do we build infrastructure, especially with the debt question, or disproportionately unfavorable PPPs, and in terms of the digitization and the platforms, protection and privacy of data that's collected. Anyone wants to go first? All right.
So go ahead.
No. It looks like Ken was ready. Please, Ken, take it away.
No, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this Africa's partners questions. So it's really interesting that the U.S. still hasn't recovered from what's been happening basically over the last 10 or so years. China's inroads into African countries and very visible inroads into African countries at that. I think the way forward is not to demonize any of Africa's many partners. I think African countries are smart to diversify as much as is possible while engaging strategic international actors in the region. Be it countries like Turkey, which has done a great deal in helping Somalia stabilize, right? So, the African Union has sent in troops, but if the Somali economy recovers, it will be in large part because of, Turkish investments and business opportunities that have come out of that. Yeah. You can fly from Mogadishu to Ankara, or you used to be able to do Istanbul and do business. So I think, and when we're thinking about, China, which is America's biggest concern, I think China offers lots of strengths that the U.S. doesn't offer. right? Chinese companies can build infrastructure much faster. The quality of the infrastructure has improved tremendously over the last 15 years. America's strong suit is in perhaps financing and more high-tech sort of products. I think America has the opportunity to leverage its strong suit in financing to also be able to have a say. And I think this idea that Africa has to choose, or African countries have to choose between the many available partners is a misguided view of how things should play out. Right? I think African countries will be best served by not putting all their eggs in one basket, by going into negotiations with all the available partners with open eyes. And this is when I'd like to also shift the ball to the African side, right? What we've seen over the last 60 years has been this habit of assuming benevolence on the part of partners, right? I think those days should be behind us, right? Everyone comes to the table with an interest in mind. People should be open about those interests. China is in Africa to do business, same with the US, and to play their global geostrategic games. That's true for everyone involved. We should be open about that. African countries should be very open about what they want out of these relationships and go for the best deals possible. I think when we are all honest about what everyone is doing, we're more likely to have arrangements that work and that are win-win-win for everyone involved.
Who wants to go first? Sure.
I can go, it's fine.
Sure.
So on the role of development partners, I do not, just like Can, I don't subscribe to the notion that we should choose for the first. Africa has a diversified port and can pick and choose what works best for us. And we are finding ourselves with negotiating hand, and we should definitely use this. Like I said earlier, last year we were seeing a bit of a competition. Between Prosper Africa and the China-Africa Development Fund. And we are also seeing that, or we saw last year as well, that the UK also committed to investing in the continent. We are seeing the EU also committing to investing more in the continent. Japan is also committing to invest more in the continent. So there's all this diversified pot in front of us, and we should definitely take advantage of it. And we should be clear that it is no longer just about aid, but it's aid for trade. In my area, it's aid for trade. We want to be strong trading partners, and any development partners that want to help us develop need to focus on how best we can economically and financially emerge on the other side stronger, and ensure that we are closing the gaps in terms of inequalities and poverty that exists in the continent. And for financing, building infrastructure without debt or without being by debt, I think there's the AU has actually been talking this, and I know Madame Iwela also talked about this quite substantially, that we should first of all look at pausing some of the interest during this COVID period. But secondly, I think we need to also look at domestic capital markets. Example here in Botswana is, before we look at or wherever the World Bank for Infrastructure Development, we should look at the liquidity that exists within our capital markets, because you can find that capital will be a lot cheaper than that one that comes with exchange rate risks, amongst others. And on the last question of security of data, Again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, please read the report on the high-level panel of digital cooperation by the UN Secretary General. We had all these aspects covered in the report, and some of the recommendations of dealing with security and data protection. And I highly recommend that we check out that report. It touches on a lot of issues that are very pertinent at this particular time as we look at digitalization within the continent. And the rollout of the report recommendations has already been happening, and there's stakeholder engagements that's ongoing on. And if you would like to be involved in that, you can go and visit the website on the high-level panel of digital on digital cooperation.
Okay, thank you. So I think they've said it all. With regards to international development partners, I think there's nothing wrong with working with everybody. And so I don't think we should be picking and choosing a side just because somebody said so. Of course, you don't want to take any kind of development advice hook, line, and sinker. You need to have your own teams, your own policy experts, your own economists, your political scientists, financial guys to analyze most of these deals. And you need to be able to, trust but verify it, put it that way. Now, in terms of infrastructure, I think Africa has big infrastructure gaps, and unfortunately, infrastructure costs money to build, money that many countries, many governments in many countries don't have. I don't think it's a given that debt is a bad thing, but I think there needs to be a lot more responsibility when it comes to how debt is managed and how debt flows to infrastructure. I think like any investment project, you need a steady income stream. And if you can deal with the risk in some way that extends the tenure of the project over a long time, then that makes it cheaper to do. I think African countries need to focus on those fundamentals, making sure that infrastructure projects are bankable, that they have steady income streams, and the risk involved in those projects are as minimal as possible. And I think secondly, there needs to be a lot more transparency around some of these projects. One of the problems with many of the Chinese funded projects in the past is that the terms are not clear, there's no transparency. You just wake up one day and see real line getting built and no one knows exactly what's going on there. So there needs to be a little more transparency around some of these debt for infrastructure projects. But I think that's something that will really help. But I don't think we should close the debt chapter completely. I think there's lots of room for a lot more responsibility to allow the capital fund projects. But I also think there's lots of room for innovation in financing. PPPs might not be very bad, depending on how they're structured and depending on the type of project. For some projects, there's just no way to do it without tax revenue, and that's clear. But I think we should not close any doors. We should leave room for all sorts of ways to finance infrastructure, because we need infrastructure, right? It's necessary. And we know that at this point in time, governments can't finance them on their own. But like Bogle said, we should try to, as much as possible, end the idea that investment is something that foreigners do. Anybody does investment. Africans do investments too. And we should try as much as possible to make investments as domestic as possible, to make them attractive to regular Africans, because if projects are attractive to Africans, attractive to everybody else. And I think a lot more focus needs to be shifted away from just trying to get foreign capital. We still need it, of course, but we need to also think about how we kind of incentivize domestic capital to invest in these projects. I think that's something that should not be forgotten.
Yeah, and I cannot emphasize the points raised by Bogle and Nonso enough. This idea of domesticating African economies, right? The habit of creating enclave FDI-driven economies it has been very costly because African countries borrow lots of money to build infrastructure that create enclave economies that are not accessible to the vast majority of their populations. And I think that's a losing bet that we should definitely rethink as a region. And I would also like to echo the question of transparency. I think this is, the reason why we need transparency from the Africa side is quite obvious, right? Prevent corruption, make sure the deals are actually financially viable, etc. But I think also China, I hope China is also learning from the last 10 or so years, right? If you have opaque deals, you expose yourself to policymakers with your partner countries not doing their homework. And that will eventually result in serious financial exposure, even for China, right? So transparency is a necessary a component of these deals, even for the China side of these engagements. And I hope that Beijing is learning to be more transparent. And because, you know, if you think of the Ethiopia deals, if you think of the Kenya deals, these are, you know, the ones that have been discussed a lot in the media, even Angola to some extent, right? If you don't have transparency, you will expose yourself to local corruption in ways that will sour the projects. And then in the long run, right, China has enjoyed a honeymoon period of, you know, positive public opinion in African countries. But if China becomes the debt diplomacy global power, right, that will erode public support for these projects on the continent, and it won't be good for China's image in the region. So as much as we're pushing that African countries need to better their game on this front, I hope China is also learning that, you know, to be the player that it seems to want to be, it also needs to upgrade how it engages the region, and realize that, you know, it can't just externalize its own very closed system. It needs to learn that, you know, African countries are very varied. How deals may work in Ethiopia may be very different when you're thinking about Nigeria or Ghana or Senegal.
I keep forgetting. Yeah, I keep forgetting to unmute myself. And this makes a lot of sense. I mean, on most times when my commentary on China has been that the Chinese possess unique competences that fit optimally with what Africa needs. Right? As Minister of Public Works, one of the things I found, especially for open tender projects, was that Chinese companies tended to be more competitive in terms of their pricing without reduction in the quality of what was produced compared to the European counterparts. In fact, in my experience, the only contractors that I saw that were able to compete with the Chinese on cost and price were the Turkish. And so China's presence on the continent for the next 30 years is a fact of life. But the problem has always been, you know, we are signing 25-year deals, 30-year deals. So the people signing the contracts today are not going to be the people in power when those deals are repaid. And so the people who are responsible, the country itself, needs transparency on that. And like you said, it exposes China to, so once people begin to tie China to an unpopular government, then China becomes a part of the problem instead of being a part of the solution. I mean, right now in Kenya, we had a conversation about this before, that the courts have ruled that the SGR project fell afoul of Kenyan procurement laws, right? If both sides had done their due diligence properly, I mean, this could be avoided. And so part of the reason why as African governments, we sort of prize the Chinese is the ability to do things really quickly, speed. But you know, sometimes speed compromises the due diligence process. And so there has to be some sort of happy medium in there. As we look forward now to, and this is where it's 1 minute, I mean it this time. I think it's important as we look forward to what the continent becomes after this, for me to reiterate, make this point again, that the informal sector in Africa, where a significant portion of the population is, we need to be able to think about that. And every opportunity I get, I tend to highlight Trigger Foods out of Kenya and what they've done with their platform, and how it is actually by providing a market and providing a platform to Kenyan farmers, Trigger Foods is inadvertently improving the productivity of agriculture. And recently, they expanded now to 50-acre farms. I think those are the kinds of things that we need to see, so that people will be able to lease, small farmers, smallholders can lease their land to a more productive farmer, collect rent on the land, and be able to use the labor elsewhere where it's more productive and be able to make money on it. So I think we need to pay attention to agriculture. I think we need to pay attention to the informal sector if we're going to build an Africa that's more resilient and more prosperous after this. Each of you has 1 minute for final thoughts, and then we will close our conversation for today. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
All right.
It's fine. So I see we've focused well-intentioned on SME, informal sector, and agriculture, and I don't want us to forget the tourism sector, which is really important in the continent and currently is going through really tough times. I mean, for most of the countries in Africa, the tourism sector is actually one of the largest employers, and those people are currently either being retrenched or receiving 1/8 or 1/4 of that pay. So we also need to have some interventions for that particular sector, and to encourage those in that sector not to stop excluding citizens. Because one of the issues with our tourism sector in the continent is that it has been largely focused on foreigners and on people coming in from Japan, from Germany, and really forgetting about intra-African tourism beneficiation and tourism travels. And we really need to work on that, incentivize locals to go, but make sure that these businesses do not go bust during this COVID, because that would also be very drastic. I have said this morning that we need to stress test our transformative policies. Anything that will make government more efficient should be done in this particular time. And the beauty of it is that no one expects you to during this COVID crisis. Everyone knows that we are learning by doing, and everyone accepts that at point there could be a lockdown, at any point, there can be a state of emergency, and we should use this particular time to really try out new things. And if they do not work out, we learn to readjust. Again, this is not our first economic crisis, and we should learn from the past ones. Thank you.
1 minute, and Nonso.
Okay, just quickly, I think a final point for me is that how we deal with the pandemic and how we recover from the effects of the pandemic is almost completely in our hands. We have the capacity to make sure that the pandemic is dealt with quickly and swiftly. Our other capacity is to make sure that the policy environment is suitable for a quick recovery. And all that depends on what we do. We need to do it now. There's no waiting for 6 months or 1 year to think about things. There's no time to drag our feet. I think we need to take the actions now, and we need to seize the moment, because how bad this pandemic gets for the economy in Africa depends really on what African countries do to deal with these side effects. That's my parting shot.
Yeah, and I would definitely echo the same point by Pogoma and Nonso. This is an opportunity to completely rethink how African countries think of policy. Right, policy has to be inward-looking and people-focused, so that if 80% of your economy works in agriculture, your budget should reflect that fact. The time spent on policy should reflect that fact. Your investments should reflect that fact. And that's the only way that African countries will build the resilience that's needed to address the other challenges that have been coming. Right. Remember, urbanization is a pace on the continent. The population boom that's ongoing. It's not as high as some of the projections suggest, but it will be a thing in the next 30 to 50 years. So planning for the future will require bold thinking. And as Pogoma said, we need to be bold in how we think about solution and be willing to learn from our mistakes and correct course. That's my parting shot.
Once again, thank you to our panelists. It's been a very, very interesting and very invigorating conversation. This, as I said from the beginning, is an expansion of our Africa-focused work at the Center for Global Development. And the hope is that in this expansion, that the knowledge content we produce is Africa facing, is intended for African governments, is recommendations coming from African specialists and African experts. And thank you for joining us today. Our next event, please look out for it. It's going to be Africa and the Dead Question. And again, we're going to have a series of African panelists and African experts discussing that. Once again, thank everybody for being here today, and you have a great day and rest of the week.